Hello and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. I'm John Streeter, and today I thought it would be good, given that it's February and a time of the year when, as podcasters and content creators in the church, we reflect on the issue of race in Mormonism, perhaps with a little more intensity and meaning than other times of the year. One of the things that early on in the time frame where I was blogging was particularly meaningful to me was looking into some of the early members of the church who tried to stand up against some of the false and racist ideology and dogma that was prevalent in the church, even confronting prophets and apostles on the issue. And there are a couple of figures that stand out. Among them was Stewart Udall. Now, Stewart Udall's story first came to my attention after I had written an article about another figure, Lowry Nelson, who had his own confrontation with church leaders on the issue of race in the late 1940s. Stewart Udall's story is a little bit later than that, in the 1960s. And as we will see, as we go through a 6-part series of his character, his actions, and the blowback that came after some of the most impactful things that he said and did, we'll kind of take a look at the character of somebody who's willing to stand up against false ideas, regardless of the cost, and compare that with what we learned from President Oaks, where he learned and came to a knowledge himself that some of those ideas were wrong and false, but he decided that loyalty was a higher priority than standing up for the people who were bearing the burden of that false ideology. So this is really kind of a way for me to capture an audio recording of this article. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the page and navigate to the article in question and then start basically reading the page. And so it's not going to be as perhaps captivating as you might expect for a normal episode here, but I'm going to read it to capture the audio so that I can edit it down and make a YouTube video and a podcast episode of this particular thing. So I just thought it would be fun to have it as a live stream in case people were interested in this story and wanted to see it as it unfolded. So let's go ahead and get the page up here. Now, if you go to the Thoughts on Things and Stuff website, you can do a search for the Stewart Udall sequence. I apologize, the website's not the most easy to navigate right now, but if you find a page that's the Stewart Udall sequence, or if you just Google Stewart Udall sequence, it'll bring you here. Then you'll have the home page, which is basically just a small summary of each of the 6 different articles that make up the story. And we're going to start today with the first article. And then throughout the rest of this month, periodically, there'll be episodes that go through each different article. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and click on the Stewart Udall sequence, part 1. This was originally published in July of 2015. And we'll start from here. Let me make sure I'm going to go ahead and maximize that. So you're not going to be seeing me. You're just going to be seeing the website itself. I want to make sure that my audio levels are good and that we have things going here. So we're going to start out. Again, I may have to stop and reread something if I mispronounce or somehow otherwise mess it up. After we get through reading this, we'll go ahead and open up the phones if anyone wants to call in and make a commentary on what we read. So we'll start out now. Stewart Udall, Sequence 1, The Conscience of a Jack Mormon. Jack Mormon is a term that early in church history referred to non-Mormons who supported and helped the church, but in modern times, it's used as a derogatory term to describe Mormons who do not live the standards of the church. This might apply to a member who attends his meetings but still drinks tea, coffee, or uses tobacco, or even someone who watches football on Sunday or unabashedly views rated R movies. Another term that has been applied to such people is a Cafeteria Mormon. Now, about such individuals, Apostle, now Prophet, Russell M. Nelson warned, quote, "Teach of faith to keep all the commandments of God, knowing that they are given to bless his children and bring them joy. Warn them that they will encounter people who pick which commandments they will keep and ignore others that they choose to break. I call this the cafeteria approach to obedience. This practice of picking and choosing will not work. It will lead to misery. To prepare to meet God, one keeps all of his commandments. It takes faith to obey them, and keeping his commandments will strengthen that faith. That's from Face the Future with Faith, a talk by Russell M. Nelson from the April 2011 General Conference that you can see at lds.org. Now, the insinuation in these types of warnings is that one who chooses not to follow every commandment is not a keeper of the faith. We remember that obedience is the first law of heaven. These faithless individuals are then suspect. If one chooses to openly break God's commandments and disregard the words of his prophet, then how can they be trusted at all? They are rejecting the morals of the church. And since they are clearly not standing for moral values, then do they have any moral compass at all? Such questions and suspicions are faced by, quote, Jack Mormons, unquote, as well as individuals who have left the church not due to personal iniquity, but instead because of irreconcilable problems with church history and doctrine. And there's a footnote here that I wrote. One thing that I've had to repeatedly communicate to my family and others who question me about my decision to separate myself from the church is that I'm still guided by moral principles, but they are principles that are not based on arbitrary pronouncements such as the word of wisdom, and are instead based on a morality which transcends religion and is rooted in concepts of natural law and non-aggression. Now, other post-Mormons may not have the same ideas as I do, but I have yet to meet a post-Mormon who is a craven psychopath for whom there is no right or wrong, as we will many times be accused of being. Okay, continuing with the article. There is a historical example of one such Jack Mormon who actually rose to national political prominence and yet faced ridicule from within the Mormon faith for his willingness to publicly make statements contrary to the messages being given by the prophets and apostles. Meet Stewart Udall. Stewart Udall was born in 1920 to parents who were of Mormon pioneer heritage. Both his grandfather and his father were stake presidents in St. John's, Arizona, at a time when such callings were rare. The Udall family was a religious family, a strong family. Stewart lived a life that is exemplary by all accounts. He was the eldest child who was a dutiful young priesthood holder who was active in the church and served a mission to the eastern states. He attended the University of Arizona, voluntarily enlisting in the Air Force as a gunner on bombers flown out of Italy during World War II, and he returned to finish law school at the University of Arizona. In 1954, he was elected as a representative to Congress and served for 3 terms before being appointed by the newly elected President John F. Kennedy to serve in his cabinet as Secretary of the Interior in 1961. Where he would serve under both Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. He expanded the national parks, supported cultural initiatives such as the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, and was a pioneer of the environmental movement. In his post-government years, in addition to championing the environmental movement, he fought to defend victims of radiation exposure, which were the effects of government's Cold War nuclear policy. An outsider viewing his career would find it inspirational. An outsider viewing his career would find it inspirational. Mormons familiar with Stewart, however, would see another dimension to Mr. Udall's life. While he was an active and dedicated Mormon during his youth, after returning from the war and finishing school, he became inactive in the church. He married an LDS woman and raised 6 kids, but in their family life, church meetings and activities were not a priority outside of what they felt obligated to do for the purposes of what he said was parent-pleasing, to keep his very active father pacified. The family that Stewart Udall kept and raised was not an active church-going Mormon family. And here's a picture of his family, the family of a Jack Mormon. Almost perfect, but not quite. Mormons who see Udall's inactivity, particularly in the setting of great professional and political achievement, are given reason to look down on him as a Jack Mormon and view his life as a warning of putting worldly concerns ahead of God, rather than the inspiration his life would be to outsiders. As we will see, the proof of this is the fact that his accusation of being a Jack Mormon was thrown at him any time his political activities were not in lockstep with conventional LDS norms. Udall was a Democrat with strong liberal ideals at a time when Mormons were even more overwhelmingly Republican than we see today. Familiar journey. What were the first steps on Udall's journey away from orthodoxy? In a 1997 interview later in his life, Stewart describes the aspects of his transition which make up that journey. Like so many people today, it started with a study of church history. Quote, I was interested in the beginning in church history. I absorbed a lot of that. There is still a fascination of mine today. While I was in the service, I did a lot of reading and spent a lot of my time. You know, Army time is 90% wasted time, and I spent most of my time in libraries. I've done some of that on my mission. I began being a very wide reader in terms of religion and literature and history and so on. During all of my reading during the war, I developed what is now called pejoratively a liberal conviction. As I read more and more widely, I became a kind of free thinker, and that encouraged the side of me which is to be free and non-conforming. And as a result of that, it was a slow drift. I began having more and more reservations about doctrine. It was painful for me too, partly because of my parents, but partly because of my attachment to Mormon history and Mormon culture. I wanted to maintain my ties. I say proudly today that I'm a Mormon and always have been, and I'm proud of that heritage. That is a quote and excerpts from Chapter 6 of Leaving the Fold, which is a compilation that can be found at signaturebooks.com. Note that it was not a desire to engage in sin and debauchery that drove Udall's transition. It was a broadening of his mind and an increase in knowledge and perspective. To the outside observer, such self-improvements may seem like a desirable thing. Mormons view such attainments with great suspicion, however. This is fueled in part by the linking of Satan and education, which is taught in the Book of Mormon. Quote, "Oh, that cunning plan of the evil one! Oh, the vainness and the frailties and the foolishness of men! When they are learned, they think they are wise, and they hearken not unto the counsels of God. For they set it aside, supposing that they know of themselves. Wherefore their wisdom is foolishness, and it profiteth them not. And they shall perish. But to be learned is good if they hearken unto the counsels of God." That's from the Book of Mormon, 2 Nephi, chapter 9, verses 28 and 29. With scriptures such as this, and the conference sermons and ensign articles that are derived from it, it is no wonder that faithful Mormons question the motives and morality of anyone who becomes educated and finds that their conscience does not align with all of the edicts of the brethren. A statement of conscience. People distancing themselves from the church, but wanting to still be loved and accepted by their LDS family as good moral people with integrity, frequently have to articulate their new principles to reassure their loved ones that they are not amoral miscreants. Stewart Udall made such a statement, and in doing so drew a line of distinction between his own personal conscience and the effects of doctrine and culture of Mormonism. He wrote a personal document articulating the reasons that he could not be a full practicing Mormon in 1947, a few years after returning from the war and around the time of his going inactive. Now, the statement was contained in his archived papers at the University of Arizona and can be seen in its scanned original form at archive.org. It starts as follows. Quote, "I feel to state some of the reasons why I cannot be a practicing Mormon in full fellowship. 1. The Church is out of sympathy with people whose views on social and political questions might be described as liberal. Said my friend, quote, I've never met a Mormon who was pro-labor, unquote. Number 2. The economic views its leaders espouse, views contrary to the traditional cooperative spirit of the Mormon people, award the bread of the world to him who can get it. 3. While paying lip service to knowledge and truth, Its hierarchy has consciously and aggressively been obscurantist in thought and act. 4. The Church has been so busy proving to itself that it has all truth that it has entirely neglected the life-illuminating insights of most secular poets, prophets, and students. 5. By subtle endorsement unconsciously given, its leaders, who are for the most part successful businessmen, underwrite the proposition that man can serve two masters. On going to the marketplace too often, its adherents leave their Christian principles at home. 6. The Church places its whole emphasis on obeying commandments, commandments which are superimposed over all other experience and learning, and correspondingly it has neglected the paramount truth that man's first duty is to be true to himself, for after all, men should find in the prosecution of their daily tasks fulfillment and not frustration of their human natures. 7. Its followers have erected a health code into a super-religion which itself overrides whatever real content the worship. Starting over. 7. Its followers have erected a health code into a super-religion which itself overrides whatever real content the worship and religious activities of the Church have. Anticipated outward behavior has obscured the vital inner man. The letter has killed the spirit. 8. In absorption in personal religion, which at times is much too personal, starting over, its absorption in personal religion, which at times is much too personal, borders on irreligion. 9. Believers view themselves self-righteously and society complacently. Their obsession with personal piety is often a form of social impiety. 10. Fellowship is made difficult because too many members find it easy to be simultaneously devout Mormons and devout anti-Semites, lovers of their fellow men in public and negrophobes in private. 11. It is a dangerous half-truth to say, as the Church has said, that if we change the individual, we will, of necessity, change the social order. More dangerous yet when its companion half-truth is forgotten and unspoken. 12. In their preoccupation with a future life, its worshippers adopt attitudes of unconcern and policies of inaction which are insensitive to the press of the present. The Church has recoiled. 13. The Church has recoiled so far from traditional religion that it has created in its services an aesthetic wasteland and has allowed the true mystical impulses go unfed. 14. There is only a place in its rooms for the orthodox. The sensitive conscience which would avoid hypocrisy must choose between 100% regularity and 100% non-participation. All this is said respectfully in the realization that the Church contains much that is good, true, and beautiful, and that it fills a felt need for most of its adherents. I nevertheless feel that I cannot enter into full communion with the Church, indeed cannot commune with it at all in good conscience, as long as these attitudes, ideas, and principles and the men who further them dominate the Church. End of document. So this document was written in 1947. You can go to archive.org and see the original scanned document. I'm zooming in on it here so that people viewing the web stream can see the form that it was in. It's got a handwritten note by Udall talking about the time that he wrote it in 1947. We can see that it's typed out on typing paper by a typewriter over multiple pages and signed Stewart Udall, 1947. All right, continuing with the article. I will leave it to the reader to decide if any of these points are still true today. Each of us have our own experience in the patchwork world of Mormonism and may find some points more and may find some points more true than others depending on the particular ward or region we live in. The point that I want to make is that Mr. Udall's departure from Mormon orthodoxy was not an amoral descent into wickedness. It was a move predicated by a personal conscience and principle. Principles in action. One example from Mr. Udall's life serves to illustrate how he held concepts of right and wrong, justice and injustice, and compassion, even though he distanced himself from the teachings and regular attendance of Mormonism. In the 1940s, Stewart was class president of the law school at the University of Arizona, where his younger brother, Morris, was the undergraduate student body president. The cafeteria on campus was segregated, and the Udall brothers, both of whom were Jack Mormons, did something to end that injustice without waiting for the Civil Rights Act or national desegregation to do it for them. They took a young black student who was relegated to eating separately outside and did something about it. The young man, Morgan Maxwell Jr., later recalled the event. Quote, Morris and Stewart Udall escorted me to a table and we sat down. Both Morris and Stewart told the manager in a strong voice close to his face to serve me and that I was eating with them. The manager looked around and took our lunch orders of hamburgers and milkshakes. That was the best hamburger and milkshake I ever tasted. He smiles. When I returned to the old main fountain, my black friends were waiting, and the Udall brothers shook hands with everyone. We thanked the Udall brothers, and from that day on, we were able to eat at the co-op. Since that day, we all agreed that only the Udall brothers could have ended segregation at the co-op cafeteria down the stairs of the old main. All of the black students admired and thanked the Udall brothers. This is from My Old Main Story, Morgan Maxwell Jr., from the website saveoldmain.org. Stewart Udall acknowledged that the church contains much that is good, true, and beautiful. One of those things is the teaching that its members should be bold in standing up for what is right and caring for those who are downtrodden. Stewart exemplified those character traits in his life regardless of his meeting attendance. Conclusion. All of the points made by Mr. Udall, Conclusion. Of all the points made by Mr. Udall, the point with the greatest impact for his fellowship with the saints was the last one. There is only place in its rooms for the orthodox. The sensitive conscience which would avoid hypocrisy must choose between 100% regularity and 100% non-participation. I found this to be a great factor in my own life. If men and women of conscience were allowed to have differences of opinion and speak openly about them and not be accused of being an agent of Satan or being subject to church discipline or excommunication, then we might be able to stay among the saints. Our ideas would stand or fall based on their merit. This is a privilege that people born into other faiths can enjoy, and is part of the reason why those faiths have been quicker to come to and accept enlightened concepts such as racial and gender equality. Those unorthodox thinkers have been able to say within their faith tradition, and be a voice for change, letting others know that it is not heresy or apostasy to follow your conscience on principles that matter. Now, for the excommunication of people like Kate Kelly, John DeLynn, and Rock Waterman, For now, the excommunication of people like Kate Kelly, John DeLynn, and Rock Waterman shows that dissenting views are not allowed. For this reason, many of us leave the fold before the inevitable excommunication. The import of Stewart Udall's story and statement is that we who have left should not be assumed to be bad people under the thrall of Satan. In many instances, our dedication to the ideas of honesty, integrity, and morality are the very things which drove our search and led us to see Mormonism in a different light. If more members can see this point, then the name Jack Mormon or ex-Mormon need no longer be the source of ridicule or shame. Next, this is the first post in a series that examines certain events in the life of Stewart Udall. His statement of conscience here is important background for what will be covered in subsequent posts. Until next time. All right, we will stop that. Okay, so I'll go ahead and finish that. If anyone would like to comment on it, feel free to call. I will bring up a web browser and go to voice, and we can add that in if anyone does call. I think what you're going to see as we go through this series of articles on Stewart Udall is a remarkable lesson for people dealing with the social issues that the church is facing today, particularly when you look at the communication that Stewart Udall subsequently had with the brethren, with the First Presidency, when he was pointing out the disparity between what was being taught around the issue of race and widely held Christian principles of universal brotherhood. The lessons that you can learn about what happens when you confront priesthood authority with universal truths and how they react to that, how they rely upon their own history and tradition of prior prophets' teaching and their own position of power and authority, with the assumption that they can tell members under their jurisdiction to get in line, is part of why the church stayed in the shadows of racism for so long, while society around them moved beyond segregation and moved to the era where they were dealing with the lower level issues of racism in society beyond segregation. But the remarkable thing that we will learn as we go through the different parts of the church is that it's not just the church leaders themselves that create this insular, self-regulating system of dogmatic adherence to belief, despite wider principles of conscience which are adopted around them. Because after Stewart Udall did probably his most controversial thing, which was to publish as the Secretary of Interior a letter in the journal Dialogue, which was a Mormon-centered intellectual journal, he published a letter calling for an end to the racist teachings and the racist policies. And he collected in his papers all of the responses that he got, not only from other intellectuals, but also from low-level members who, reading his protest against these false racist ideas, decided and took it upon themselves to write him and tell them their opinion of him going and speaking against the brethren. And it really is a cautionary tale for us in the modern day dealing with social issues and how we deal with the things that the church has previously proscribed and how they've gone to maintain their hold on the conscience of members. This is something that we'll see more in parts 3 and part 4. Not only do we have record of what low-level members wrote to Udall after he did this, but we also have a record of what sitting apostles themselves wrote to him in the wake of him publicly as a highly placed political figure, calling out the church for its false and racist ideas. And he didn't do it in a demonizing way. He did it, as we will see, in a way that appealed to the higher values and notions that the church held. You could, even in the era before the lifting of the priesthood ban, make an argument in a case based on love, based on the highest human ideals, to do away with the ban. And that's what Stewart Udall did. And even affording the brethren that charitable perspective, he still received a great deal of lashback, which we will see. All right, well, I am not getting any calls, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Let's see if there were any comments. Okay, so we've got somebody who says, throughout the 19th century, Jack Mormon meant someone favorable to Mormon agendas. Jack Wilson was Voca, the ghost dance originator, raised Mormon, the closing is magic. I don't know about the second part of that, but the first part of it is very true. Back in the era around very early church history, hold on, we're getting a call. Let me see what we got here. Hello, hold on just a second. Let me set this up again. I have to remove and then stop the screen sharing and then Let me get this over here and we will share screen, Chrome tab, voice, audio. All right, you're on Thoughts on Things and Stuff, or Talk on Things and Stuff. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hi. I've watched you for a while, but I'm like so nervous calling in. It's silly. Um, so one of the things I was thinking about with Stewart Udall and all of this, I've left the church now really recently. And one of the things that my family growing up, they were very TBM, true
Mm-hmm.
believing. I was too. And I think such a big part of that is just this belief that we kind of make the prophets and the apostles to be so perfect, and so in my family it was, if they're speaking as the prophets or the apostles, which is a gray, who knows when, who doesn't.
Yeah.
If they're speaking in that mode, then to my family it was, this is what God wants us to know. And I think one of the huge problems within any change ever being affected in the church by when that kind of thinking is there is that for my family, it's not that you're speaking against men who have made some bad decisions or have faulty reasoning. It's that they go straight to, no, this is what God is saying.
Hmm.
And for me, coming to a place where I struggled a lot in my life with believing that God actually loved me. And I think that's something that a lot of LDS women and men have dealt with. And for me, like, as I came to believe that, like one day I just said, okay, I'm throwing everything else out. I'm going to believe he loves me, and I'll go from there.
Mm-hmm.
And what I came to was, oh my gosh, these things don't make sense if he loves me. And I myself am not, gay or anything like that, but it helped me start to relate and go, well, that's just, how does that make sense with a loving God? How does this make sense with a loving God?
Mm-hmm.
Which eventually led me to doubting. But one of the things that had to break for me, a shelf that just had to go for me to start criticizing the church, was that these prophets were so infallible. And I just feel that's a big thing that is a problem within our doctrine for people to be able to speak up. Because if you believe you're speaking against God instead
Yeah.
of against men, you're not going to do it.
Yeah, and that really, what you identified right there is really the root of it, and that is that the church equates the statements of these men speaking as prophets with God. And
Yeah.
so if you disagree with the men, then you're disagreeing with God. And so how do you exist in a system that makes that equation? How can society move beyond any errors? How can society and the church
hmm
hold this contrasting? And what you're speaking to here is part of the difficulty that you have when you start to speak to people, because when you're in the church
Yeah.
and you're among believers, there's this whole unspoken thing, as we understand he's the mouthpiece of God, and so we don't refute it. But then later on, when you start saying, wait a second, what he said doesn't make sense with these other ideas, then they say, well, no, we never said the prophets were perfect. And
Mm.
so you're like in a double bind where you're supposed to believe and accept their statements as the word of God, but if you find problems of it, then you can't hold them accountable to it, even though they aren't perfect. And it's just a mess that leaves you blaming yourself, and it
Yes.
builds into that cycle of self-recrimination and self-doubt, because anytime you find a problem, you have to just say, well, my judgment is wrong, my judgment is bad, I'm
You
finding
have to
too much fault.
gaslight.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah. And I think, oh, go ahead.
no,
Sorry.
that's all right, go ahead and continue.
I think one of those things is the mental gymnastics become astounding. And I've heard it said that the smarter you are, the more advanced your apologetics become, which might not be entirely fair, to take pride in that necessarily. But I watched my family over the years, like, and it's never, oh, the brethren were wrong and they changed,
Hmm.
such as the exclusion policy. It
Right.
was, we don't know why God asked that, but he did, and now he's no longer asking it. And so there's never any leeway there,
Yeah.
and I feel like the only thing that could change this, when it's the only thing I feel like could actually change it is if the brethren would actually come out and apologize, would actually be a little
Yeah.
more honest. Because and a lot of ex-Mormons and stuff have seen this and have looked through things and gone, I don't think these men get any special revelation compared to the average person. I
Yeah.
don't think that they all get together in a room in the temple and it becomes a giant feedback loop. You know, of
Yeah.
course you feel that these policies are a good idea. Do you have a single gay person in the room? Do you have, you know, like, how can you make these decisions for these different groups when you're not one of them, and you won't even bring one of them in to, I mean, maybe they do to consult, but
Yeah.
you know, I think about that policy and I go, how could they have thought that was a good idea? You know, had
Yeah.
they consulted anybody external,
Yeah.
they would have gone, oh, no, 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 you don't want to do that.
Well, even the way that they frame it today shows that a lot of that mentality still exists. They will defend.
Mm-hmm.
There's like this black hole around the policy itself, and they never actually address whether or not the policy itself was inherently racist by its very nature. They
Oh, I
talk
know.
about the
Mm-hmm.
reasons given for the policy. But if you just say, okay, I've heard you about the reasons. Let's just forget whatever. It doesn't matter if no reasons were given at
Yeah.
all. Assume that this policy was given without any reasons at all, and no one ever made any assessment of the reasons. Is the policy itself inherently racist? Because we look back
Mm-hmm.
on that era of segregation and we see these old rusted signs that say whites only or no colored people over the
Mm-hmm.
swimming pool or over the fountain. Well, you could put a whites only sign on the temple without any
Mm-hmm.
other reason or rationalization. And that shows how inherently racist it was. And by the church leaders
Yeah.
continuing to not disavow the race ban itself and say the race ban itself was the product of racism and was wrong and false and should never existed from the beginning, then they're continuing to allow and perpetuate this racist core at the center of the issue and attributing it to God. And so there's a degree of accountability on that fact, which has yet to even pass the lips of anyone. Now, when I say anyone, unfortunately, what we see is that some of the voices who are out there defending the church on the issue of racism, and I'm thinking particularly of Darius Gray,
Mm.
aren't drawing this distinction between the ban itself and the reasons for the ban when the words come out of the mouths of the prophets. So there's a recording that you can get
Mm-hmm.
on the YouTube channel that I have, which is a snippet from a presentation Darius Gray gave. And he talked about how
Mm.
his impression of what the brethren are doing in writing the gospel topic essay. And he talks about how the ban itself, that the church has acknowledged that the ban was racist and the product of racist folklore and tradition that was prevalent in the society. But by saying that the church has acknowledged that the ban itself, rather than pointing out that the church has never acknowledged that the ban itself was racist and only the ideas around it, it allows the brethren to continue to escape the sort of accountability that you're talking about, which is where if the brethren actually apologize, acknowledge that what they said and did and taught in the past was wrong, then it actually rebuilds some of their faith and trust in the minds of its members, and it allows people to take that lesson into the future and say, well, this means now that it should be okay for us to disagree with things that the brethren have said in the past. And for me, that was why Stewart Udall's story was so important, because this is an example of a very high profile white Mormon speaking even against, he himself didn't have any personal disenfranchisement because of the ban, but he saw that it was wrong. And so he could speak out against it without people accusing him of just trying to be uppity or just trying to, ingratiate himself. And that's the sort of thing that I think any system where we've tried to move away from racist ideologies, racist practices, did also need people who could look on the disenfranchised and be motivated by the compassion in their hearts, even though it didn't affect them directly, and speak and work out against it. And we saw that with the issue, when you look at the stories of abolitionists in our nation's history, there's a lot of that as well.
Yeah. One other thought I had just listening to that document that Stewart Udall himself had written, I was amazed to recognize how incredibly similar it is to
Yeah.
how I feel and how I think a lot of current ex-Mormons or questioning Mormons feel today.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you're able to break that barrier and go, okay, this is men making mistakes,
Yeah.
And then you're able to go, wow. But I think one of the things that's so frustrating, and he pointed out in there, there's this pride that we just carry around. There's this superiority that we carry around. And it's awful to see how that has trickled through, and it's justified in the Book of Mormon. It's justified in all these different places that, why, yes, be so proud of yourself because you know the truth. And
Yeah.
for so many of us, did we ever know the truth, or were we just taught this as a child and never thought to question it? Because it was taught by our parents. They
Mm-hmm.
taught us everything else we needed to get by in the world. So why wouldn't they have told us the truth? And I think for most of us, our parents believe they were telling us the truth, of
Yeah.
course. But then that, I just, for me, that was a big thing to go, well, goodness, I see why people get so trapped, because you don't think back to it very often. You don't go back in your life and go, now, what have I held since I was 2 that maybe I should rethink now?
Yeah.
But when you're able to do that, I think a lot of change is possible within a person.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of the growth that happens with the sort of faith transition that Mormons who go through it happen. If you've seen the Mormon Stories podcast interview with the Showalter family, one of the things that really struck me is that Sister Showalter, I forget her first name, talked about how she viewed the world and how she viewed issues of social import before her faith transition. And it was very much just, I rely on the brethren, I follow the prophet. And there's a simplicity to that that carries along with it the ability to be so sort of arrogant and egotistical, because the only lever that you need for that is that the prophet speaks for God. Whatever he says then is implicitly true, and I can trust it. And then I can even
There's
boldly
also,
pronounce it.
yeah, there's also a big element to it of feeling safe.
Hmm.
That black and white world is so comforting, and that, well, even if they're wrong, God knows what he told the prophet. He knows what the prophet told
Yeah.
me. So it's on the head of the prophet. It's not on my head. And you really have to stand up and be willing to face big mistakes, which again is kind of ingrained into the religion. You don't want to make mistakes. You don't want to mess up.
Yeah.
And so it creates a very, we're not allowed to use the C word, right? But it creates that dynamic of a cult.
Yeah.
It creates that inescapability that those
Yeah.
tend to have within them. And
And you're
and
right.
that's
Udall was identifying
really
that in
difficult.
that document when he talked about
Mm-hmm.
the focus on outward appearance and just the fact that
Mm-hmm.
people are not free to have any dissenting opinion. If you see that in any other group, you're like, that's really the degree of groupthink there is really difficult. Something
And
came.
that,
Go ahead.
yeah.
After you get
Oh,
through
go
that,
right ahead.
there was something that you said that brought something to mind where you're talking about how the brethren are meeting and coming up with these policies and ideas that are really just human and from them.
Yeah.
And it reminds me, at some point I'll make a video on this, but there's a very revealing talk that Dallin Oaks gives in a training
Mm-hmm.
for stake presidents. And he's trying to teach the stake presidents how to recognize the voice of God and the will of God in executing their duties. And he gives a story about how when he was first called as an apostle, he sat down with Bruce R. McConkie, and they were choosing where to send missionaries on their mission. And he describes how Bruce R. McConkie would just say, okay, this brethren is going to go there, this brethren is going to go there. And he's like, well, how can you do that? And he said that Elder McConkie's response to him is what informed him about his role and how he should approach being an apostle. And what Elder McConkie said to him is, Elder Oaks, you are an apostle of God. He has given you that duty, that responsibility, that mantle. And so in the execution of your duties, when something comes into your mind, that is the voice of God communicating
Oh,
to you
goodness.
his will. And so that's the first point, okay, is that these
Mm-hmm.
men have been trained and educated within this closed system of belief to believe that ideas that pop into their head are the will of God. And so then they can pronounce them with that surety, with that authoritative voice as the will of God, even though if any of us in the rest of our lives thought about thoughts and things that intrude into our minds, we can say, well, those are the result of our subconscious. They are very human. They are not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily to be relied upon. And in many cases, they may reflect our own biases and perspectives that aren't necessarily right. And so we need to treat them with a measure of distance and continue to reevaluate the world around us and reflect on whether or not they're right. But the brethren don't
We
have
kind
that.
of, yeah, we need a system of checks and balances, essentially. We need to trust, because I think a lot of times people do, I don't believe this anymore, but I don't hold it against people who do believe in their own intuition or in the spirit telling them something, because a lot of times I think they do have incredibly good ideas. I think they do have things that can be very helpful or very loving. But often I think it's good to double check that
Yeah.
with someone you trust, with someone around you. And again, the problem becomes, you get so far up in the system, in the hierarchy, and there's no dissenting voices anymore, it sounds like.
Yeah.
From some of those leaked tapes with the senators and such, where it's the church broke ideal. And I can only imagine it's even more so if you're going to be leading the church. And so again, getting stuck in this closed vacuum, and people want to make change from the bottom. But a lot of times I wonder how, like, the church is going to advance, but it kind of has to limp along, because we don't have, a millennial who grew up with friends who were out as gay and who saw everything that went on in their life. We don't have people who relate in these ways that need to be there, who can have that compassion. And again, it's so frustrating, because you look at it and you go, really, this is supposed to be Christ's church, like Jesus, who accepted anyone, and it's not our job to judge. But then again, they believe it is their job to judge while they're here on earth, and it creates a very frustrating system, and that belief in divine revelation. But again, there's still this hierarchy. It's, well, if you're deciding for yourself, fine. If you're deciding for your family, fine. But if you want to speak to what you think the church should be doing, well, sit back down and shut your mouth, because there's someone else delegated to do that, and it's not you. Yeah. And that's awful. Like, it shuts down ideas immediately. It shuts down concerns immediately. And if that, and I think in a lot of ways, some of these things have changed. I know we've come pretty far from the days of Brigham Young and Joseph Smith, and
blood atonement.
And there's, yes. And there's a lot that you can say now before getting excommunicated, and it seems the majority of things they worry about recently with excommunication seems to be how publicly vocal you are. Yeah. If it's just you in your home ward, why, no big deal. You get on the internet and see you later. Yeah. But I think that's just that's a good thing, But it's interesting. Sometimes I've wondered if they openly apologized, would they get some members back? Would they keep more members? Or would they have such a mass exodus of perhaps a slightly older generation, or the more TBM youth, so to speak? It's a big question there. Like, no doubt to me, it would be better for the apologies, and it would move things forward, and it would be amazing. Mm-hmm. But if you're thinking in that corporate mindset, how do we keep X many people in, and you're just thinking numbers. I wonder what goes through their minds sometimes as far as that. And I think they perhaps just don't see, like, especially the upcoming generations. Like, I think I'm technically a millennial and we want that shift, Mm-hmm. We don't want this harsh lines drawn in propriety and all of these things. Like, our society has shifted so much, and we appreciate people being straightforward and honest and open, and we don't want to trust somebody above us. We want them to tell us why we need to obey an order, and I think that's been there throughout all generations. I don't mean to say that we're especially special, but it's just something that sometimes when I've looked at older members of the church, I go, yeah, they really like that paradigm. They really are comfortable, with how it's been for so long. And I just have hope that in the future it'll keep getting a little bit better as time goes on. But at the same time, I love the work that you're doing, and I love how a lot of your content is not necessarily initially judgmental. That let me look at it when I was still kind of like, oh, I shouldn't quite look at anti-Mormon. I don't know, but slowly, as they say, like, you shift into where you're like, okay, I think I'm okay, and I know a lot of people would say, oh gosh, you fell for it, never, not even one step. That's what happened, that slippery slope. But I think when you look at it in a different context of, I grew up in a high control religion that is specifically saying don't, but they don't tell you why, or when they do, they're the only source, it's like when the brethren say, we love you so much. I think you love me, I think a lot of times you might think that, or we just are doing our very best. And it's like, anyone can profess that.
Yeah.
Anyone can make this profession, and to just trust them outright, it's very similar to again, I think there's so many things in Mormonism that keep you um, in a subservient, childlike position, but not in the good kind of childlike,
Right.
more of a, you just need to listen.
Yeah.
And obedience is the first law. And it just makes me want to throw up, because even when I was a very believing member, I saw very quickly, I was like, the core of the gospel, according to the plan of salvation and what was supposed to happen prior to this life, it was agency. Agency was this thing that had to be preserved. It was Satan's plan to make us all do these things in one pass for everyone, kind of a
Yeah.
feeling. And the whole story is that Christ went up on that cross and went into the Garden of Gethsemane so that you could be yourself and make these choices for yourself. And when you watch the church engage in manipulation and fear mongering and guilting and all that, it's really upsetting. When you sit back and go, that's not, no, there's this clear divide, between. It's so interesting how we can compartmentalize to that degree, to believe that this is Christ's church, and yet to still engage in and accept all of that manipulation that's happening.
Yeah. And I can, just hearing you describe your own journey in that regard, I get the sense that understanding some of those terms that you've described, such as fear mongering and things like that, just being able to put a name to it and identify it, not even having to identify it in Mormonism, but if you can identify it in other groups or something like that, so you have an understanding of how those things can be wielded as weapons against the mind of people who are trying to do good, trying to be faithful, then it becomes easier to see it in your own tradition. And that's kind of been part of the focus of some of the stuff that I've done here. But I appreciate you sharing your journey with me.
It's been a huge help to me too, actually. A lot of when you go over fallacies and different things like that, phobia induction and such, and I was like, oh my gosh, and I said, oh my gosh, now I know why I'm so uncomfortable listening to general conference talks. I just couldn't for years. I would just feel so demoralized afterward, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's what it is, and I was able to kind of pick it apart. Whereas before it was all, what's wrong with me? Because it's always the member. It's never what they're saying. It's always you. And I got to a place in my life where I broke through that. And I hope there's a lot of other women and men out there who will be able to do that. As time goes on, I hope they'll be able to have that self-confidence. Because I think one of the things that's, just as a last thing here, one of the things that's the worst is when you're taught to trust someone else instead of trusting yourself.
Yeah.
To go to them before you go to you, which I think was something Stewart Udall said as well.
Yeah.
So that's what I would encourage. You're going to be okay. Like I wasn't sure, but on the other side of it, you're happier, you're better, you're healthier when you trust yourself.
We hear the church talk about that you need to have childlike faith, and there's this allusion to the innocence of childhood that seems like a good thing, but it's really a very dangerous thing, because it's that childish perspective that never, that you've automatically inherently placed your trust in some higher authority, your parents and they're placing themselves in the position of the parent, so that you never do trust yourself, and that you're perpetually dependent upon them for anything that might transition you into a state of independence. And it's not just, it's on your whole way of viewing the world. So I appreciate that that's part of the growth that goes along with this, is doing exactly what you said and learning to trust yourself more. And that's what people in any of these other groups have to do in order for them to break away, is to trust themselves more. And that's what I love so much about 1984, George Orwell's book. The whole concept that Winston says is that if 2 + 2 equals 4. If I have the freedom to say that, then everything else follows. And what he's saying is, if I have the freedom to trust my own perspective, my own judgment of the world, and I can state my reality that 2 + 2 equals 4, then even if Big Brother says that it must equal 5 or 3 or whatever Big Brother says it must equal, then he's able to separate himself from the will and purposes of Big Brother. And that, to me, you talked about how the smarter you get, the more complex your apologetics get. And there's some truth to that, because you have to appeal to much more convoluted ways of thinking the deeper you dig into the contradictions. And it takes a degree of creative genius to do that and to make it sound even plausible or approachable. And so there is a skill to that is definitely identifiable. But it becomes, at some point, it becomes so convoluted and so complex that you just say, wait a second, let me just compare that complex, convoluted machine
Yeah.
with the simple acknowledgement that the church is not what it claims to be. Joseph Smith was acting in a manipulative way, using the voice of God to deceive others and to gain position and power for himself. And that just makes so much more sense, particularly when we have so many more examples of people in the world and in history doing it.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you're probably aware of his channel, but Jimmy Snow, Mr. Atheist, he's
No, I
fairly
haven't
big
seen
on
it.
YouTube. You should look into it. He's started a call-in show recently. You guys
Oh,
should
yeah?
like team up. Yeah, he is ex-Mormon, has been out for a while now, but he said in one of his videos that he was looking at the whole story of Joseph Smith and just the whole thing, and he was doing that same thing. Like, how does this all make sense? Okay, this has to work somehow. And then he finally went one day. He just went, okay, if I throw that out and I look at the possibility that he was a charlatan, and he just went, oh my gosh, it all fits.
Yeah.
And he was just like, it was so easy. It was
Yeah.
so easy, but we're programmed, we're taught, we're indoctrinated. Don't you dare. Don't you dare touch that. Don't you even consider it. And it's really a shame, because if we're to exercise that agency, we need to be able to truly look at all sides, not these straw men,
Yeah.
and not these boogeymen that they build. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on today. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for the call. It was very insightful. I enjoyed your comments.
Yeah, good luck. Keep it up
All right.
with your channel.
Thanks.
Okay.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye. All right. So, again, the lines are open. If you have something on your mind and would like to call, feel free to do that. I am going to go back through and see if we missed any comments that are worth talking about. Okay. History of the LDS Saints says, my TBM father, who was a fifth Quorum 70, fully embraced and believed in the curse of Cain and the Lamanite curse. He believed that the race and priesthood essay was a form of lying for the Lord. 2 days after receiving my 23andMe results, we found that he has North African DNA, and I'm not sure he believes the results of the test. That's a difficult position to be in as a long-standing member. Okay, we've got a call. Let's see. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hi there. Hey, I want to acknowledge what an excellent job you've done with all of your research and posts and comments. I sure appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much. What's on your mind today?
Well, what I can't figure out is how, when people go through the Mormon temple and they do the anointings and washings and all that kind of stuff, and then they put on their green apron that represents Lucifer's power and priesthood. I know that they shun the Christian cross in the chapels and in the temple, and I'm thinking it's more of a Luciferian cult, disguised, posing as a Christian. So if you could expound on what this endowment with the green aprons are relative to Christ and his gospel, then I'll buy you lunch.
Well, so if I heard someone coming to me with that perspective, there's a couple of responses that I would have. The first thing would be that I think it's very common for people to look at the green aprons that are part of the temple clothing and then hear that Satan also has an apron and that's mentioned in the temple ceremony, and then say, oh, well, that apron then represents the apron of Satan. And I think that for people who have gone through the temple and looked at it from how the temple is trying to teach what it's trying to teach, then you would say, well, actually, that's a little bit different from that. What the apron represents is the garment that God provided to cover the nakedness of Adam and Eve out of some fig leaves, and it's symbolic in that regard. And that Satan.
Okay, hold on.
Sure.
Hold on a minute.
Well, let me finish
say,
my
right.
perspective, and then we'll talk about that. And
all right.
And then there's this notion in Mormon theology and kind of the metaverse of Mormonism that Satan creates counterfeits or distortions of true principles in order to try to deceive people and after an imitation of God because he lusts after God's power. And so when you see in the temple ceremony that Adam has alluded to Satan's apron, and then he kind of boasts and looks at it and says that it's a symbol of his power and priesthood. Mormons who have adopted the conventional view of these things would say, well, that is an example of Satan creating a counterfeit of something that is true and real and using it to try to manipulate Adam or Eve. And so they would see the garment itself or the temple apron itself as the real deal, the green one that God gave that was part of that creation story, and then they would see Satan's garment and apron as a pale imitation. Now,
Okay.
that's kind of
Now
how I
let me
take that issue. What is your take
Okay.
on it?
Well, I'm not a Mormon apologist, for one thing. It says right in the endowment, and I have not been through, but I have seen
Mhm.
the videos, that it represents Lucifer's power and priesthood. And it's basically the priesthood of man. You know, it's
So you're talking about the part in the ceremony
Lucifer's,
where
yeah,
Lucifer has shown up and Adam says, "What's that thing that you're wearing?" And Lucifer says, "Well, this is a symbol of my power and priesthoods." And
right.
so I think that,
Okay.
yeah, that what you're talking about there would be what Satan is talking about, what Satan is wearing at that time that he's
But
interacting
then
with Adam and Eve.
right, and then he invites them to hurry and put it on. Now, here's the interesting thing, and this is just the world according to me. In the Garden of Eden in the Bible, it says, God says, "Where are you?" Like as if he didn't know, and Lucifer or Adam said, "I'm hiding," and he said, "Why are you hiding?" And he said, "Because I'm naked." And he said, "Who told you you were naked?" And he, let's just say religion, because the thing is that's where shame base started is Lucifer shaming Adam and Eve. That's my 2 cents worth. I have a real issue with any organization that tells me I need to pay them money and that they're going to tell me what underwear I'm going to wear and how
Yeah.
I'm supposed to make love to my wife. When I was way, way, way back in the day, we went in for a temple prep class, which was
Mhm.
down to a university, which was nothing to do with what goes on in there.
Yeah.
And then the bishop calls us, or the stake president calls us in and interrogates us separately. And then he pulls us back together, in the intimidation thing. Well, we're getting some conflicts of stories, and I'm thinking I didn't lie, but my wife did. And I thought, well, if this is all it means to her is just to be able to lie to go through there, I'm not up for it, and I never went. But the strange thing was that he said, "Did we participate in any unnatural sex act?" And I said, "What's unnatural about sex?"
Mhm.
And he wanted to get into tell me how I'm supposed to have a sexual relationship with my wife, and I just thought it was a bunch of BS. I'm sorry, but it's just awful. To get into somebody's wallet and somebody's underwear or panties.
Yeah.
I just can't believe that. It's the big what's in the temple. They go in there and there's nothing in there. And there's beautiful buildings. I mean, Trump Towers is probably more beautiful than the Mormon temple. But then again, they've been saving this $100 billion to maybe pave the city with gold. I don't know. I'm just not a very good.
Well, I think what you're talking about in terms of bishops who insert themselves inappropriately into the private lives of members is an important theme. And it's part of the growing process that people have to go through once they transition to a new perspective regarding the church. And that is your ability to draw boundaries and to say no. Because one of the things that bishops take advantage of is the idea that they should be able to ask anything about your life, and that because they are a judge in Israel, it's their right to do so. And if you don't do it, then you are somehow insubordinate or defying their
Right.
authority. And, you as a grown married man, being able to say no to a bishop prying inappropriately into your private sexual life is one thing. But because they wield that same weight and that same authority against children as young as 12 years old, in some cases as young as
Oh
7
yeah.
year old, just imagine how
Hmm.
much more inappropriate it is for them to sit
Oh,
in
I'm sure.
private and to drill into those things. And we know from the stories of victims that have come out that there have been bishops that have abused that, and there have also been cases where children who become accepting and kind of groomed to the idea that a man claiming authority can cross those boundaries of propriety on
Right.
discussing sexual matters have made them vulnerable to other predators in the future. And so
Oh yeah.
part of the thing for
Well,
me,
here's
go ahead.
go on.
Well,
Well,
when I
go on.
think
I'm
about
listening.
raising my own children, that was a really difficult thing to wrestle with because we went through a period of time where we were thinking, well, the church may not be totally true, but no church is perfect, and maybe it's a good place to raise children. But when you see the problems and the harmful ideas and normalized behavior that goes along with that type of behavior, we eventually came to the point where we just could not accept that that was a healthy place in which to raise children. And
Yeah. It's interesting how you started the show off relative to um, morals or ethics if you leave the church and stuff. And what I found interesting is they justify anything by the concept of well, God's laws are greater than man's laws, and basically they
yeah.
don't have to follow man's laws, and it's kind of frustrating that way. And then the other thing is, I could not sustain them as prophets, seers, revelators back in the year 2000, so I just resigned my membership. I went to church a few times or Sunday school and talked to, engaged and stuff and pointed out a few scriptures, and the person teaching the class was kind of visibly shaken, and I made a comment, and it was a woman, not to be sexist, but it was a woman that the others agreed with me. And then the next time I went, I made a similar comment pointing out the incorrect teachings in the doctrine that are relative to the Book of Mormon or the Bible, since many chapters, 25 or more, have been copied word for word out of the King James Version. But so the next time I went, it was another a little bit of a disruption. And so I just realized that I couldn't go because I was just upsetting the situation. So I gave him the space,
Yeah, that was one of the things that
that
we heard Udall talk about, where the church is so rigid and so has such high expectations for conformity that you either have to be 100% in or just associate yourself completely. And I think when we look back on the record of people who really want to give it a shot and really want to try, and the church says that it's open and visitors are welcome, and so they say we're going to take them at their word, we're going to go to the meetings, but if we hear something that we believe is false or harmful being taught, we're going to speak up about it and
mm-hmm.
engage the conversation. And it sounds like you tried to do. And then there are other facets of Mormon culture which just clamp down on that. I mean, if you start with the whole idea that contention is of the devil, and that if anyone expresses any ideas that are different from the standard line, then that is a form of contention, then people, as soon as they feel that discomfort that goes along with any disagreement, all right. I think our signal got lost there for a little bit. Yeah. So backing up, anytime you bring up anything that is uncomfortable or causes some disagreement, they're going to see that as conflict, say that its contention is of the devil, and attribute it to Satan.
Yeah.
I had an experience where I started a conversation that was just based on the point that if anyone claiming to speak for God advises you to commit genocide or rape or murder, then that proves that they don't speak for God, and you should be okay with ignoring them in that regard. And that conversation led to the bishop's wife standing up and declaring that the spirit has left the room and having to leave. And it's sort of the same thing
Oh
that
my
you're
God.
talking about, where
Yeah.
you can just see where it's uncomfortable. And if they're unwilling to have real conversations where people can have different perspectives and we can learn from each other, then all you're doing by going to meetings where you're just tied down to the same simplistic ideology is you're just reinforcing infantilism, where people are not free to actually speak themselves. And if you can't explore ideas that are different from, follow the prophet, then you don't learn and you
Follow
don't
the
grow.
prophet is in PROFIT or PROPHET.
Well, we're seeing more now that
I
there's a lot to follow if it's profit, PROFIT.
okay. Oh my gosh. Hey, I just want to give you an award for your all of your research and your podcast and
Oh,
stuff.
thank you very much.
I sure do appreciate that. I was quite a minority back in 2000, and I had a little bit of hell to pay because of me wanting to raise my son and give him the blessings in the organization, and they wouldn't let me because they just, according to the bishop, my son was under his authority because he had the Aaronic priesthood, and I said he's under my authority because I'm his father and he's a minor. And we went the rounds that way, but they didn't make it easy for me.
Yeah. Well,
I went to so I'm not here to
my hat's off to you for being able to go on that journey before the age of the internet. I don't know that there's any way out in Texas that I'd have been able to do that before things were available on the internet. So much respect to you for that.
Thank you. I spent some time with what's her name? Utah Lighthouse
Sandra
Ministries.
Tanner.
Yeah, I really do believe that a lot of her books should be part of American history. It really should be.
Yeah, they've done some fantastic work. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, hey, I appreciate your program.
All right.
I appreciate you allowing me to call in and make a few comments. And
well, thank you for your call,
Thank you.
and we'll see you next time. Take care.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. I think one of the things that the caller brought up near the end is a real struggle for the church, and that is dealing with the cultural aspect of the church and allowing the religious and theological aspect of the church to coexist. There are plenty of people in other traditions of, for example, secular Judaism, where they are allowed to exist within the culture of the church and celebrate their identity without having to necessarily be tied into the theology. All right, we got a call. Let's see what this is about. Hello, it's Thoughts on Things and Stuff.
Hi, I just wanted to call in and thank you for being out there.
Well, I appreciate the call.
Can you hear me?
I can. You may want to mute your TV or your computer. There's a little bit of an echo.
Let me get you on the phone. I'm 73 years old, and I grew up in the church up in northern Utah, up in the Cache Valley area. And my family folks were active, my relatives, and come across the plains. And up until the internet, 10 years ago, I just felt like I was out there by myself. You had nobody to talk to, nobody to discuss the issues. And I don't think there's many my age that have went away from the church.
Yeah, you're talking about a time period where it was so hard to get a hold of any of the material which really shows the whitewashing, the contradictions, and all you really had was the Tanners and the Lighthouse Ministry, and they were demonized so strongly that I can't imagine what it would have been like to feel like an outsider to the church and not have anyone to talk to.
I was active. I raised my kids. I went on a mission. I, participated in different callings, and I'm not disappointed that I went on a mission. It's my heritage. Mormonism is my heritage. But yeah. I grew up in the golden age of David O. McKay And my dad was bishop and during the 60s, and the wards had more to say about what they had in the buildings and what went on. Like we had a scout room and it had all the mirror badges on the walls, and my dad was really a scouter and got me through the Eagle and everything. And then when they coordinated everything, that all went away.
Yeah, you're talking about a world of Mormonism I never even got to see, but I've heard about it from people like yourself who talk about an era where, the stage in the stake building was actually used to put on plays and productions, and there was a great deal of local community-driven activity and creativity that was afforded to members that just didn't. I mean, I think I caught probably the tail end of some of it because they were still doing road shows when I was young, but soon those disappeared. And it feels like some of the fun social aspects of it just dried up.
Yeah, the whole community, our whole life centered around the church. And you'd go to Mutual on Tuesday night and have opening exercises, and then the scouts would go to the scout room and the girls would go to the mine mates, and then after you met, if we was doing a road show, you got in the gym, and an older couple would teach us ballroom dancing, and there was a lot of social life going on, and same with the primary, and when the church took all that away from us, I mean, it wasn't the same. You lost all that. And my dad, he's passed away, and I think he'd really be disappointed that they went away from scouting. That they have done away with that program, and it's just not even the same church anymore. And they dictate to the members what they're to believe and what to do.
Yeah.
What
was some of the things? What were some of the things apart from the changes you saw in the social direction, but just historically or theologically? What are some of the things that caused you to question or to doubt, even if it was privately, back at that time, even at an age where you've maybe already raised a family and are an empty nester or something?
Well, part of it was blacks holding the priesthood, and during the 60s when they was having their, the protests about the blacks, and the church was real slow to finally give the priesthood to them. And it was kind of like polygamy. The church was forced to abandon polygamy. Mm-hmm. And I had relatives that moved to Canada to keep practicing, and things like that. And then when they come out and finally admitted that Joseph Smith had a stone and a hat and all the essays to correct what the teachings were, and when I grew up and went to seminary, I mean, he had a Urim and Thummim and a breastplate, and that's how he translated. Well, now they're telling the members, well, he didn't need the gold plates to translate. He just looked in a hat, and all those things they taught us then, they're retracting what they taught.
Yeah.
And that's what the last time I went to Sunday school was 10 years ago, and the lesson was on the scrolls and how he received them, and he translated the scrolls. And I'm sitting there in Sunday school, and some of the members said, oh yeah, my great-great-grandfather was involved in helping get them, and that was true. And I sit there and I just started to shake. And I got up and I walked out the door, and I said to myself, that's it. I'm not going to church anymore. They don't teach the truth. They whitewash it. And it was scary. I got home that night, and it was dark, and I walked out and I looked up at the heavens, and I said to myself as I walked around, I said, what do I do now? Where do I go? What's happened? And thanks to John DeLynn and John Larson and those early podcasters and that, I had somewhere to sit and listen and realize that I'm not alone.
Yeah.
That I wasn't by myself, that I had others out there. And and then you came along and I really like the program you're doing now and how you're reaching out and that. I listened to a lot of your early ones when you did the puppet and kind of those things. Remember that?
Yes. He's still around.
Yeah. But I'm happier now. My wife is a non-believer now. My children were way before me. My daughter, she resigned from the church in the 1980s.
Wow.
And what drove her away was polygamy and Joseph Smith. And she went to the church office buildings in Salt Lake City and visiting Salt Lake, and she decided, I'm going to resign. And she went in the office building and says, where do I go resign? And they looked at her like, what? And they said, well, go up to this floor. And she went up to this floor and walked in there, and she said to the lady, I'm here to resign from the church. And she said, we have to write a letter. And she said, well, give me a piece of paper. And she wrote a letter and signed it and handed it to him.
Right then and there.
Right then and there. And a few weeks later, she got a letter that she was not a member. The bishop came by and encouraged her not to resign, and she had made up her mind. And my kids worked on me for a long time, my wife and I, and we went to church by ourselves. But none of my family children are in the church, and we're so much closer together. We live together in a big compound, and just we enjoy each other, and we live by the moment. Not worrying about the future, not worrying about the hereafter. We're together and loving and taking care of each other, and that's the way it should be.
What is
they preach?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask you, since you're an older gentleman who went through this process where your children did talk to you about their own reasons for transitioning away from the church, and this is a question that comes up with a lot of people who are my age who, because of the internet, we now are out of the church. And the question is, well, what do we do about our parents? And a lot of the times the answer is, well, they're so old, their whole social world is the church. That's, why can't we just leave them alone and let them be happy? We don't have to show them the problems in Joseph Smith's and history. What is, having been kind of on both sides of that, existing before your kids and your own acquisition of knowledge changed your perspective? What is your response to people who may say it's not worth it, just let them be if they're older?
Well, the way my children approached me was, they started pointing out Joseph Smith and that, he was a pedophile, and I'd push back at it. I was still going to church, and I would push back, and they'd push. My wife would really push back. She's go by the rules, don't rock the boat. Everything's fine. And
yeah,
and she was the organist, and she played in the piano at primary, and she enjoyed going. But the thing that finally pushed me over the edge was I got an iPhone. And I was up here in Utah doing some work for my sister and her husband on their farm. I'm a carpenter. And at night, my mother was watching TV, and I didn't have something to watch because she was, watching TV. So I was in the bedroom, and I Googled up Mormonism. And the first podcast that came up was John Larson. And when he started, he was rough, he swore a little bit and cussed. And I started listening to John Larson, and it just hit a point that, hey, I believe this. That's stuff I believed my whole time. Even when I was kids in church and I had little kids, I'd get discouraged about what they were preaching, and I'd pinch my young baby to Christ so I could go out and walk around the church house and get away from it.
I remember those days.
You remember those days?
Oh, yeah. All the other dads out there, too. It was great.
Yeah, and that's my girls just kept kind of not getting upset, just kept telling me. And once I started to studying, and my daughter had studied a lot, and I couldn't leave it alone. When they say you leave the church, you can't leave it alone.
Yeah.
I mean, I just started studying everything I could find, and the first year or two, I was just mad. I was mad. I was mad at the brethren in Salt Lake. I just mad at the whole thing, and my children gave me support and helped me through. And then it took my wife about 5 more years, and she knew something was wrong. She knew, we was going to church, and I just finally, I said, I can't go, and I quit paying tithing first, and then a while later, when they come out, and I've got family members that are gay and lesbian, and a brother that really went through hell back in the 80s and in the 70s, and they tried to deprogram him, and when the church come out and said that none of the children can be baptized to couples that are living together, my wife said, that's it. I'm
Really?
done.
So that was recently then, and that was the issue
Yeah,
that did it.
That was the final issue that did it. We did go to Salt Lake and walk with the others on Protect the Children.
Oh, really? You were there?
A couple years ago. Were you there then?
I was, yeah. I was one of the people who got to hand one of the books intended for a particular apostle. My book went to Elder Holland.
Oh, yeah.
But,
yeah, we were there. We were there. We didn't walk all around the block because we're older, but we were there sitting on the steps and that, and participating in that. So
well, that's great.
Yeah. So I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing, and the Sunstone and all that to help kind of build a community and people to express how they feel and what they're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, back in the 40s and the 50s, then they just went away and they were sinners.
Yeah.
They might drink, they might smoke, and they were sinners. And today you don't have to feel like you're a sinner when you leave the church.
Yeah. And I think that was what was so powerful about Stewart Udall's letter here. When I first went through all of the different letters that he had, this one thing where who would think that somebody who is making a conscious effort to distance themselves from the church would write a document articulating the principles that led them to do that. I mean, that's such a unique thing in the first place, but then to see it in amongst his paperwork, when as you'll see what he eventually did, just reflecting back on this being the start of it, where it really shows you the character of the man and where he was at that point. And you're absolutely right. For me, a big important part of this was making sure that my family understood that even if I've left the church, it doesn't mean that I don't believe that there are wrong things and that there are right things, and that I can still be a good person and I can still have a moral compass. It's just not subordinated to men falsely claiming to speak for God. And there's plenty of people out there that do it.
Yeah, I agree. And when I was coming up through the church and I'd make friends. I made a lot of friends outside the church, and they were good people. And I'd look at them and I'd say, why does the church think they've got the right to say that we're the only ones that can be happy?
Yeah.
This is the only way to be happy and to be good and to care about people. And that bothered me. Even before I quit going to church, it bothered me that there's other good people in this world that care and raising their children and teaching them. And they don't have all this restrictions on how you should, believe or how you should act or how you should live,
Yeah. That's a powerful point that I can kind of remember the different phases of my own life on that question of looking at other people. And I remember very much at the part of my life where I was very much indoctrinated in that I only really accepted things that the brethren taught, where I would look people that would seem to be happy, and I would be like, they don't really know true happiness. What I have in the
Yeah.
gospel is true happiness. That is Satan's counterfeit that it leads people away. And then I remember the part of my life where I started to validate and understand that people can be happy outside of the gospel, and I have happiness in the gospel, and God is not going to prevent people from being happy if they're not outside the gospel. And then I went to the phase of my life where I understood that there are things about the gospel that create a great deal of unhappiness, but you're never allowed to identify those things that drive your unhappiness as coming from the church, the theology, the doctrine. There's this psychological pressure for you to always frame it as happiness. And when you let go of it and you allow yourself to stand on your own 2 feet and realize that you are as a human, good enough as a person, you don't have to depend for your existence on this authority framework, then you can start to build happiness on your own terms and not only experience happiness through the lens of this religious authority, which distorts it all. And that's kind of the evolution of the different phases of how I perceived happiness now. And it's much more liberating and much more self-validating, and I think promotes growth personally more on the other side of it, from being in that indoctrinated side where the church has captured happiness.
Yeah, and what I've found is I reach out and socialize with more people, outside the church,
Mm-hmm.
and realize that, hey, they're on this earth and they're trying to do the best they can, and and the kindness I can say to them, or give them some money, on my own terms, and just give them a little happiness and help them out.
Yeah.
I just feel liberated that I don't have to do it. I don't have to pay that tithing. I don't have to go and work at the church farm, or have to go clean the church or go to the temple. That, I can, participate in the world and the people here in the world, and reach out to them. And I find that people that I know that are relatives in the church, they're so negative against people outside the church, and we'll go down the road and they'll see some person on the sidewalk asking for money, and they criticize why aren't they working? Why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they? And you don't know their condition. You don't know why, they're in that stage. And you can't control where the money goes. If you give money out, just let it go and let it help them. If it helps them, it helps them. And that's what I enjoy in life now, is being able to feel free to interface with other people in other walks of life.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel that then.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to, I don't know how Mormons in the promised land of the Utah, Idaho area exist, but out here in the mission field where I grew up in Texas, you always find yourself as the Mormon in amongst a community of non-Mormons, Southern Baptists, evangelicals, Jewish people who are not of any religious tradition. But there's this insular community you're a part of. So you may live in a neighborhood with neighbors to the left and to the right of you and across the street, but you'll go years and you'll never actually really get to know them, because any bandwidth or space that you have in your life for social connections gets devoted to the church. And even though the church says that we have to love other people and not judge other people, just the fact that they don't live to the standards, they don't have the view of the truth that you have, places them into this other category, which makes them either an investigator or somebody who has refused missionary things. And I mean, in my position, it was like I didn't even want it, because I knew that would taint any relationship that I had with them. So it's like I didn't even want to approach them with gospel stuff, because I knew that they were not going to accept it, and it would then just create awkward relationships. And so one of the difficulties that I've had, even for myself, as I've moved away, beyond the church or outside of the church, is I'm not really good at connecting with my neighbors and dealing with them on a totally normal personal level, because I'm so used to the crutch of having this common ideology and experience of Mormonism that I can instantly connect with someone. It's a lot harder. Then on top of that, I'm not into sports. I'm not into anything that other, guys are into. And so it's like I have a harder time connecting with people, but I can
Yeah.
definitely relate to feeling the freedom to connect with people without that underlying judgment that creates that distance. I mean, for me, I felt that I think more with my extended family, where it's been a lot easier to connect with them after getting out of that paradigm.
You grew up in Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I grew up in Utah, but when I returned from my mission in 1969, and then I got married and my wife in the temple here in Logan, and then we went to Salt Lake, and I went to carpenter school, and my wife worked for J.C. Penney's, and I told her at the time, I says, I don't want to live here in Utah and raise my family. And she said, why? And I says, because I don't like the influence the church back then had on the community as far as the politics.
Mm-hmm.
Because they controlled the TV station, they controlled the newspaper, and they controlled the politicians. And so when I graduated, I moved up to Boise, Idaho, where it was more, less members and other people. And I worked as a carpenter and a superintendent my whole life, and worked in the Pacific Northwest. So I met a lot of people outside the church because of my career. And then I retired, and I'm a snowbird, and I go to Arizona, and I'm there in the winter time, and then I'm in Idaho in the summertime. But I started a business in Arizona, a sawmill business, and it's making a lot of money, and I'm out meeting the community and selling wood and just really enjoying life. And that's how I was able to reach out, because of my career.
I see.
Working with that. Yeah. So, if you have any more questions about me?
Well, I think we've got some comments. Let's see. We've got some people just commenting on some of the things that you've observed about Mormon culture. Particularly about the insularity of Mormonism. It's funny that Mormons want to claim the reputation of being the happiest and the friendliest people on earth. There's this concept of love bombing, where as soon as people see you as somebody that they could potentially bring you either into the fold or bring benefits to the fold, then they are overwhelmingly friendly and loving. But a lot of times your friends are really determined by what happens when you're not in a position to give them something that they want. And if you've rejected the missionaries, if you're not a member of the church, if you leave the church, then that friendliness facade tends to go away. And I think that's just where you really want your friendships to be based on real, authentic connection, rather than only being seen through the lens of this group and its controlling messages.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your call. I think I'm going to wrap it up here.
I have one question.
What's that?
There's one comment. They're redoing the temple in Salt Lake City. Do you think they'll whitewash all the Freemason stuff off of it?
I don't. I think they're going to preserve it. I mean, Mormonism really likes its symbolism and its metaphor, even if it's stolen from other places. I don't know. There's very little that I think they'll get rid of. Even like the penalties in the temple that are supposedly gone, they're still, when you consider the hand shapes, they're still there. They've just kind of concealed them a little bit. And I think things like the sun and the moon and the pentagrams, the inverse pentagrams, those things have had historic meaning for the church, and I don't think they'll get rid of them. But I could be surprised. I mean, you lived through the time where they got rid of the priesthood ban, and now the false doctrines around the priesthood ban. So maybe they will get rid of some other things that create more problems than solve.
Well, we'll know in a few years when they're done, won't we?
Yep, we will.
All right. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye now. All right, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you for those that hung around to the end of the show, and hopefully we'll be able to take the audio portion of this and synchronize it with some visuals that will be a compelling presentation of part 1 of the Stewart Udall series. Definitely look out for the announcements for the subsequent parts. My favorite part is part 6, where we start looking at some of the other contemporaries of early people in church history, so we can compare how non-Mormons, even in the Christian world outside of Mormonism, were acting boldly in defense of false notions of racism that people used biblical justification and other types of justification for. When you compare that with how the brethren were entrenched in their false racist ideology, it just is a remarkable comparison, particularly in light of Elder Oak's comments about loyalty at the 2018 B1 celebration. So until next time, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff, and we will see you